Okay, so it's a pleasure to have Andre de Roos, who's a professor of theoretical ecology at IBED, at UvA, and also external faculty at the Santa Fe Institute. And he's going to tell us about the dynamics of stage structure food webs. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So indeed, the title of my talk is Everything is a Network, but the network is not everything. And the dynamic, indeed, I will focus on the dynamics of state-structured food webs. So what's the issue? The issue is that we all know actually that biodiversity is important. By the way, do you see the Zoom control in the sharing, or do you only see my slides?
No, we see your Zoom control on the top. There's 18 participants. Yeah.
Okay. So I should switch this off, and it's something like Command H or so. No, that's not what it is.
As under the dots, if you push
but
the dots of more, then it's.
I know, but look, if I do that, oh yeah.
Yeah, and then you can hide floating. Yeah, right.
Good. Better.
Perfect. Perfect.
So I think that broadly in society, everybody knows that biodiversity is important. At least if you've read the papers, then this is the idea you get. And the idea is really a kind of intuitive idea that diversity is good. It begets stability of systems. It's a very old idea in ecology that dates back from the 50s and 60s. And it has to do with the feeling that it's a kind of, portfolio effect. If you have a complex ecological community, a complex natural community, then it contains many links. And hence there are many different ways from the top to the bottom. And that is a kind of multiplicity of ecological checks and balances. And the idea is still going on now. And there are some experimental data sets that show that indeed more diverse systems may be more stable and hence maybe in some sense better. But the data sets are actually pretty limited. They are limited to, for example, experiments where people planted 2 types of plants in a field compared to 1 type of plant. And then you see that 2 types of plants, they give a higher yield. So the experimental data to show that biodiversity is really important is really a problem and limited. And and theoretically, we have a problem. We cannot really explain why biodiversity is important. And let me tell you why this is. So natural communities, like you see here, let's say what you see at the left is actually a food web from the southern Atlantic Ocean with whales, and that is mostly driven by this organism krill. To the right, you see a food web that is from a soil in the Flevopolder. These food webs, that is how we actually conceptualize the ecological communities, and we conceptualize them as species with links in between them. An important role of formalizing the interactions in the ecological communities is what we call is the community interaction matrix. It's the matrix that indicates what is the per individual effect of one species on the population growth of another species. Mathematically, it corresponds to a Jacobian of a large differential equation system. But more intuitively, you can think of like, okay, well, how much does an individual of species J actually reduce or promote the population growth of species I? The elements somehow reflect the interactions between the species. So the bottom triangle is the positive effect of, for example, of a prey species on the growth rate of its predator. The top right triangle, the above diagonals are the negative effects of the predators on the growth rates of its prey. They reduce the growth rate, of course, because they kill off prey individuals. And then the diagonal is actually something that we call self-regulation. I will come back to this later on, because self-regulation is something rather specific. It involves cannibalism and interference. So it was actually a physicist, Bob May, who has been very important in theoretical ecology, who started to analyze the communities from a mathematical perspective using this community matrix, using this Jacobian. And he used random matrix theory to analyze actually what would happen if I increase the number of links between species, and what would happen if I increase the number of species in my community. And he turned to the world, or the ideas that are prevalent, upside down, because he actually showed that larger communities were less likely to be stable. And if you had more connections between species, they were also less likely to be stable. His conclusion is here at the bottom. He says that there is no comfortable theorem assuring that increasing diversity and complexity actually begets enhanced community stability. Rather, the opposite is true. And he challenged the ecologists by then looking for devious strategies that make for stability of empirical systems. So I have to come back to this concept of self-regulation. So most of the time we think of communities as interactions between species. For example, you see here Konig horses in the Oostvaardersplassen that compete for food, and they exploit this common resource. This is all, these type of interactions, which generally are considered very important for among ecologists, they are between species, they are embodied in the network structure. This self-regulation are more things like direct fighting between opponents, cannibalism as one example, and for example, nest site competition. And even though we can find examples of such direct interactions, self-regulation in certain species, they are actually not very prevalent in all species. If we think about fish in the ocean, well, most of them do not cannibalize at all. So it's really, and things like interspecific interference or nest site competition, they are limited to mammals and birds, but not to the 98% of the species on Earth that are not mammals or birds. So the going idea is that competition and predation, so the interactions between species, are actually the driving force behind the ecological communities that we know. Nonetheless, these are two statements from a review from 2017, who did a lot of analysis on both observed food webs, but also theoretical food webs. And their conclusion was that the food webs cannot be stabilized unless the majority of the species actually exhibit a lot of self-regulation, and this self-regulation is strong, meaning that possibly more than 90% of the species should be regulated simply by their own density. So this actually creates a paradox, because on the one hand we believe that species interactions and species dependence are very important. Competition, predation are very important. On the other hand, our theory tells us that we can only explain that communities are stable if competition and predation are less important and self-regulation is the dominating force structuring communities. So the question I address here is actually going from the conceptualization of the network. So the up to now, all the focus has been on the stabilization of the network through the network topology, the food web properties, the interactions between species. And this community or interaction matrix plays the dominant role there, the density effect of one individual on the growth of another. And so we see that that actually gives rise to the fact that self-regulation is crucial for community stability. But to what extent are these insights the results of the fact that we conceptualize this a community as a between species interaction network? And in particular, what's the difference of what's the effect of differences between juveniles and adults?
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So in the limiting case in which there is no self-regulation at all,
yeah,
isn't there an optimal network topology that would actually give stability?
No.
Not at all. Okay.
I will show you some examples in a moment.
Okay.
Actually, so
okay.
Can I also ask a quick question? What happens if you take sort of evolutionary effects into account, where you say that, well, some links could be leading to stability, some others to instability, and evolution selects the stable links because, well, they are stable? Could some arguments like that be made?
So there are actually rather. I think that the short answer is no. You can make arguments that say that are rather artificial, like if you say like, well, okay, if a certain species drops below a certain density, then predators stop foraging on it on that species. Then you somehow artificially impose assumptions that in a theoretical setting give you stability. But overall, there is a kind of negative relationship between the number of species and the interaction strength and the average interaction strength within the network. I didn't write down the formula for it, but Bob May actually derived a formula that expresses this negative interaction. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. And these questions that I address here are actually reflect the core of my research over the last 20 years, which is actually to show that the conceptualization as a species, as just a collection of identical particles, is the wrong one to take, because it actually neglects one of the one important process that is unique to ecology, and that is that individuals develop throughout their lives. Every individual starts small, develops while it not reproduces, starts on some point to reproduce, and so this process of development from birth till replication is something that is everywhere in nature. All species have this, and it is something that actually is not accounted for in the classical conceptualization as a species of where a species is just a collection of identical individuals. So the focus up to now has very much been on this, like the network complexity, the between species complexity. What I add to that is a more hierarchical complexity, and in particular, I add the link between life history of an individual and the population dynamics. And so instead of considering a species as a collection of identical individuals, I just add some very elementary differences between juveniles and adults. So I constructed random communities, and I did that by just taking a large number of species that I randomly assign a body weight and characteristic body weight, and individual of a particular species forages on a size range of species that is smaller than itself. This is roughly what you observe in nature, that species eat other species that are about 100 times smaller than themselves. There is one basal species. I have to assume that there is one species that carries everything. So I have a single basal species there. If you would just look at a species level description without making any distinction between juveniles and adults, it would give rise to differential equations like on top here for all the species, where you have a kind of growth term, the first term. You have a loss term due to either mortality or due to just maintenance rates. And then you have the interactions here that represent the network of in the community. And these psi factors are actually the selectors, the preference of one species on the other. I will assume that only the basal species is somehow self-regulated, but all the other species are not self-regulated. And what I did was just created communities by constructing 500 species with random body weights on a logarithmic axis. I gave them species-specific parameters that are more or less derived from allometric relationships that have been observed. And then I simulated dynamics until transients disappear. So if you don't distinguish between individuals, this is what you get. Even though you start with 500 species, you end up with something like 4 or 5. And the type of communities that result are very simple. So linear chains, sometimes a little bit branched, but most of all, it's very simple and small communities. If you look at the dynamics that result, they tend to be wild oscillations with large amplitude. If you look over all the simulations I did, then the red bars here are the maximum densities of all the species. The blue bars are the minimum densities. And what you see is that the larger the communities, actually the minimum density goes down, so which leads to extinction. So this is actually what puts the limit on the community size, that with larger communities, you actually lose species because they drop below threshold levels. So how do I introduce then differences between juvenile and adult stages? I do this in a very particular way because I want to make a comparison between the model without any structure and the one with structure. So I assume that that juveniles and adults have identical diets, but that they forage on these diets at different rates. And this parameter Q gives the difference, and it's a kind of asymmetry parameter. So if Q equals 1, then juveniles and adults are identical. And I will focus on a situation where Q is actually smaller than 1, which implies that juveniles are more food limited. Juveniles and adults are also preyed upon by the same predators, but there is also a difference in the rate at which they are preyed upon, and that's this phi parameter, which is again an asymmetry parameter. So for phi equals 1, the predation is the same. And I will focus on the general situation that juveniles are more vulnerable to predation. And so for Q equals 1 and phi equals 1, we actually have a model that is mathematically completely identical to the model without any structure in it. And the further assumption what I then have to make is like, what actually happens? What do the juveniles do and what do the adults do? Well, juveniles mature and adults reproduce. So they have very different roles in their dynamics. And both these processes actually stop when there is too little food. So here is a kind of a little diagram of what I assume the individuals, we have of a particular species, we have juveniles and adults. They forage on the same prey base, but at different rates. And this Q parameter you see here, and 2 minus Q for the adults. Juveniles, they mature into adults, adults reproduce. So these two stages are tightly connected. They cannot persist without each other. And both these rates are dependent on how much food you get. And then predators exploit the juveniles and the adults. And the phi parameter is actually the parameter that, that governs how much more juveniles are eaten than adults. And I will focus on Q smaller than 1, which means actually that maturation is more limited by food than fecundity. Basically, growing up is more costly than reproducing. That was a question.
Yeah, can I ask? So why is this different than just extending your network and adding more groups with specific interaction between them?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and it's because juveniles and adults they form a really important. They cannot persist on their own.
Right,
but that's just juveniles on your own, and right. So you can draw it. Of course, you can draw it as a network within, but you get two types of interactions. You get interactions that are about feeding. Mm-hmm. And you get interactions that are about maturation and reproduction. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, you can conceptualize it as a network, but as an extended network. Mm-hmm. But how do you then deal with the fact that you actually have interactions of different types?
I draw arrows with different colors.
Sure. And in a sense, yeah. Absolutely.
Okay.
You know, but it's the different type of interaction that you actually that gives rise to the results.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
So the system of equations is indeed doubled. You know, you have adults and juvenile. You have juveniles and adults now for every species. Here you see these reproduction rates and the maturation rates, where this plus actually represents that it is cut, that it stops below a certain threshold food level. And important parameters are this Q and this phi parameter. So they are really the asymmetry parameters. So if I now do the same type of simulations, this was the result without stage structure. So if you introduce this structure, then actually you get about 5 times as many species in a community as when you have no stage structure. If you look at where it happens, then you see that it happens because when there is an asymmetry between juveniles and adults. Notice this is this foraging asymmetry. So this is this Q parameter. This is this phi parameter. So the symmetry case is here down at the right bottom corner, and there you see that if there is no asymmetry between juveniles and adults, we actually retrieve the fact that we can only find small communities. And so maybe this is also an answer to your question, like, okay, if I have twice as long, I have indeed twice as many nodes. But still, I can still end up with only small communities if there is no difference between these two stages. It is only when, you know, juveniles are more vulnerable to predation than adults, and the development process is more limited by food than the reproductive process, that you find larger communities. They also are more complex. So these were the type of communities that you actually observed without any stage structure. This is the type of community that you observe if you have juveniles and adults, where the blue part of the circle now indicates the fraction of the individuals that are juvenile. So this stage structure also promotes community complexity. If you look at the dynamics without stage structure, where these large oscillations, they are completely stabilized if you introduce this juvenile adult stage structure. And in fact, something like 23% of the simulations converge to a stable equilibrium. And you don't see this effect that with increasing community size, that the minimum densities that species attain actually goes down. So they stay constant, minimum densities. So this is all nice, of course, but the question really is, how does this come about? And that's, I think, the main part that I'm interested in this talk. I can simply rewrite the system to a mathematically equivalent system in terms of the total density of species, the sum of the juveniles and the adults, and the fraction of juveniles. I have done a system, indeed, that is, if I have n species, it's a 2n differential equation system, and the stability is determined by a Jacobian, where that I can distinguish 4 parts of to the Jacobian matrix. The interesting thing is that this, because of the way I set up the problem, this top left submatrix is exactly the species level interaction matrix that has been so important in previous studies. So yes.
Is this the A1, the first matrix you showed in the beginning of your talk?
So it corresponds to that matrix in the beginning of my talk. It's exactly the species level interaction matrix. So it's the effect of an individual of species J on the growth rate of species I. It has exactly that same interpretation.
Okay, but then your solution to stability has nothing to do with self-regulation. Is that the conclusion?
So I only have I only have the basal species self-regulated. All the other species actually are not self-regulated. In fact, the A1 here has mostly positive elements on the diagonal instead of negative diagonal elements.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
The other parts of this of the blue matrix A are on the one hand this lower right corner. This is what I call the dynamics of the structure subsystem. So it's the effect of the fractions of juveniles on their own dynamics. And then you have the off-diagonal submatrices. They are actually resembling the coupling between the two, between either this, on the one hand, the species level matrix, the A1, and the structure, the population structure matrix, A4. So what I now do is look at what are the for all the species, for all the communities that were stable, I looked at the dominant eigenvalue of the full matrix and the dominant eigenvalue of the A1 matrix. So basically the matrix that determines that characterizes the network of species interactions. And so you see that here, the red lines, the red dots here are the eigenvalues for all the simulations that ended up stable, the eigenvalues of the species level interaction matrix. And as you can see, they are large, they're positive and large, whereas the eigenvalues of the full matrix are negative, which is of course obvious because I only look at stable communities that resulted from simulations. But what you have to conclude from this is that it's actually this the coupling with this population substructure that lends stability to the network. The network itself, if you would measure it in the field and you would infer the interaction strength between species, you would actually infer that it is unstable, but it's actually the coupling with the substructure that lends its stability. I push this a little bit further because by focusing on one particular community. So this is the community I'm looking at. You see here the eigenvalue of its species level interaction network, and this is the eigenvalue of the full system. If you do perturbation experiments, then you can easily perturb the densities of the species by about 50%. And what you will see then is that it quickly actually goes back to the equilibrium state. In other words, the communities tend to be rather robust against perturbations. If you do this for all the communities that resulted from the simulations, then a 50% reduction in density of all species leads to this reddish colored community size distribution, where the blue colored community size distribution was the original one. So you see, you might lose one or two species, but overall, the communities survive pretty much intact if you disturb the densities of all the species at the same time by about 50%. However, if I take this community and I just assume that the fraction of juveniles in the population is fixed at its equilibrium value, so throughout the entire simulation, I just fix the fraction of juveniles at its equilibrium value, and then simulate the species density subsystem with that fixed equilibrium value for the fraction of juveniles. If I start out in the equilibrium state, you see that after a short while, things start to fluctuate rapidly and species go extinct. And in the end, you have 3 species left. If you do this for all the communities all the stable communities that resulted from the simulations, you actually see that the final distribution of community sizes, the red distribution here, is more or less the same as the distribution of community sizes that were derived from unstructured simulations without any juveniles in it. I can make another assumption, and I can make the assumption that actually the rate at which juveniles mature into adults is constant throughout time and equal to its equilibrium rate. This would mean that it's not so much the a dynamic development that juveniles go through, but it's more an age-determined development that takes place, so that throughout the entire time, the rate at maturation is constant for juveniles. Also, then you see that starting in an equilibrium, you get very quickly, you get wild oscillations that eventually again lead to a final size distribution of the community that is very much the same as when you have no state structure in your population. So the conclusions that you can draw from this is that it's really the coupling between the changes in the population substructure and the abundance that alter the complexity stability relationship. It increases the community diversity and the complexity, it dampens the oscillations. And in fact, the dynamics of this structure, of this population structure, annul and override the influences of the network that in itself are actually destabilizing. So it's these two components of complexity, not only the network complexity, but also the hierarchical complexity from the life history to the population level, that lends stability and robustness to communities. This has also broader implications, because on the one hand, from an ecological point of view, it has implications for data collection. There are huge efforts being at present to collect all kinds of data about biodiversity in the Netherlands, but they tend to be species level, and that will be the norm probably for still quite a long time. They're not even counting all individuals. Sometimes data are only about the most conspicuous life stage. So a famous example are butterflies. We have a butterfly foundation. that collects large data sets on the occurrence of butterflies all over the Netherlands. They don't have any information about the caterpillars, but about 99% of the individuals die in the caterpillar stage before they ever reach this butterfly stage. And food webs also tend to be networks between groups that we as humans actually impose, and there is not, and they don't necessarily match actually with the dynamically relevant ecological entities. So the question that you can really ask is like, to what extent do the type of data that we actually collect at present to make all kinds of decisions about conservation or protection and management, is it sufficient to understand the dynamics of the community at all? From a more theoretical side, the species level modeling framework is really all over the place, and it is the workhorse of ecological theory. And what's called the Lotka-Volterra interactions, which embodies this species level framework, will remain the norm for a long time. But how reliable are actually predictions of these models, and how useful are they for management purposes? If you think about what's happening in the Green Deal in the EU, then there is one of the developments that digital twins have to be constructed for also ecological systems. And these digital twins really are species level modeling frameworks. So what power do they actually have? What predictive power would these modeling frameworks actually have? The other thing is that there is a lot, currently, of course, as in every scientific discipline, there is a data revolution going on, large data sets, e-science. There is a lot of effort into data-driven modeling or analysis of data through advanced statistics or AI. But there is very little attention actually for conceptual thinking and theory. What do these data really represent? And do they really give us information on the components of a system that actually matter for the overall dynamics? And more philosophically, of course, data are considered objective, despite that they depend a lot on how we conceptualize things and how we collect things. And overall, as the last part, yeah, there is a strong tradition in population and community ecology to follow the type of species level conceptualizations. But when does such a paradigm actually turn into a tunnel vision is something that I've been wondering about for a long time. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, we have time for some questions. If people don't mind that I start. Can I ask about the matrix you have that you divided into 4 pieces?
Yeah.
Is the diagonal of the A4 matrix important?
I don't know. I mean, the diagonal, if I looked at the diagonal elements of the A4 matrix, and the distribution of those elements is centered around 0.
Okay. So that sounds like it's not very important.
So yeah. But one of the questions that I have myself is like, is there any theory on this type of where you have 2 different subsystems and you have coupling between the 2 subsystems? Is there theory on the matrices that result from that, and what would lend them stability, and what would be the dominant eigenvalue? How would it respond? Can we estimate something like a bound on the dominant eigenvalue? Right. But I haven't found anybody that can actually give me some information about it. So
yeah, I don't know. I can see that Wout has a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for your great talk. It was very interesting. You basically had in your models, you basically had two asymmetry parameters, Q and phi. I'm taking it that they are the same for all species.
Yes, in this case.
Is there any way to get these from experiments or from observations of real communities? And
So,
do they lie anywhere close to the red region that you showed in your plot?
Yeah. So so for the phi, it's pretty obvious, in the sense that the parameter that the red region where it was located implies about that juveniles are 10 times more sensitive than adults to predation. If you measure the body size of predators and their prey at a species level and at an individual level, there's about an order of magnitude difference. That means that the predators really take something that is 10 times smaller than the average size of prey in the population. So that parameter is more or less in that region. The parameter for the limitation of maturation, there are also, the data are much more scarce, but the few data that are there point in the right direction. And I also must admit that this Q parameter for the foraging asymmetry might be model specific. If I take a slightly different formulated model for the maturation and reproduction links, then this Q parameter, the influence of this Q parameter is much less important.
I see. Thanks. I had another question though. You gave a mathematical argument for why this extended, considering juveniles and considering the structure leads to stability. But do you have like a physical or biological argument which can explain that, or is that still?
Well, I think that so. I have an intuitive argument, and the intuitive argument is like that the structure introduces a certain dampening effect in the network, because just imagine that food for a particular species increases due to some perturbation. That leads adults actually to reproduce more. But these adults then reproduce juveniles. Juveniles are more vulnerable to predation. So they are being quenched by the predation. And also, if they are more limited by food, then the increase in juveniles will actually slow down their transition to the adult stage. So that's like that's how I explain intuitively what the dampening effect is. And so, but to prove that this is actually, the underlying mechanism is not something I can do, actually.
Thanks. Thanks a lot.
Han, you had a question?
Yes, actually also two, but let's first do one. The first question actually is that, I remember from some time ago in discussions in biology about the stability of ecosystems, that the spatial component was quite important. So I remember this work on spiral waves, that actually in the differential equation you now use, there is no spatial component. But if you implement this in cellular automata type of simulations, then there is a spatial element, and that's appeared to be very stabilizing complex system. So is this now forgotten, or was this false, or why is there no spatial component in your model?
There is no space component in my model because of because to limit the complexity of the system. It's very obvious that if you have a spatial dimension, if you, for example, have two spatial habitats that you couple in some sense, that weak coupling will lead to will promote stability. So that would be an additional. If you talk about spiral waves, then we're talking about systems where the interaction distance is actually small. It's actually, and those you might find in. There are not many examples where you would actually find things that would satisfy the assumptions that you would actually get spiral waves out.
Okay.
If we think about a lake, for example, it's pretty much homogeneously mixed.
But generally, the idea that adding a spatial component or dimension to this type of simulation is stabilizing is still a valid idea.
If you assume that there is weak coupling between the spatial components.
Okay, the second question. There's mostly competition in your model now, but there can also be mutualistic relations in ecosystems. So what does this change your story a lot if you add more mutualistic relations in the A matrix?
Yeah, I have to, that's one of the things on the on my to-do list. It's the problem there is that how you formulate mutualistic interactions. There is a much less uniformity in the models that represent mutualistic interactions than foraging interactions and competitive interactions. So I'm not sure how to represent it in a way that is satisfactory, actually.
Okay, thank you.
Vitor, go ahead.
Hi. So first of all, thanks for the great talk. I really like this idea of decomposing the matrix into two different ones. And I was thinking, I think very recently I read some paper where they were also discussing this problem of how May's system, well, kind of refutes the hypothesis. And one of the solutions I've seen is to include, and I guess relating to these mutualistic interactions, to include some nonlinear responses on the species predation. And once they include that, they also recover the result of more you get stability from diversity. So I was wondering if you thought about how these kind of stage structure is actually a more microscopic description of this phenomena of having kind of non-linear responses in predation. And I think you do hint at that when you gave your intuitive argument. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do hint at it in my intuitive argument, but also not entirely, because I also think that the delay is important. You know, that a disturbance, a positive increase in the density of a species does not immediately translate into a positive growth rate of that species, because you first go through a juvenile phase. So this is something that yeah, and it also has, you know, yeah. So that's one of the aspects that I think contributes as well. So this delay is next to that, that the foraging intensity indeed changes, the delay is also an element. I think that yes, you're right that there is always some scenario that you can dream up that you actually can find a food web that is stable, or that a mechanism that lends stability to a food web. But then I refer back to actually that quote that I gave from this review in Nature, Ecology and Evolution. They looked at very many different food webs, both empirically observed, but also modeled food webs. And their conclusion was basically, well, overall, self-regulation is the thing that we need. And many papers that actually say, well, okay, this is stabilizing, say this is stabilizing, which means in that sense, we need less self-regulation to stabilize the system.
By the way, I guess I'll just keep with the tradition of the two questions, which the second one is, so this, I guess, other discussion of whether actually the notion of stability might be kind of the wrong one, in the sense that you do want fluctuations to keep, plasticity, to keep all these other mechanisms, and that is what makes your system more stable in another sense.
Absolutely.
How do you view this discussion?
I think that the fluctuations are indeed okay, and it's not that we, but the problem really is these large amplitude fluctuations in species density that arises from our classical characterization of an interaction between a predator species and a prey species. And that's the real problem. That fluctuations occur is actually in some sense positive, because otherwise you would lose also all kinds of genetic diversity, because it's very a constant environment is very selective for only one type.
Thanks.
Mauricio, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the talk. Also quite interesting. My question, and maybe you mentioned something about it and I missed it. I mean, for what I understood, most of your models are at the population level in terms of densities. Have you looked at models at the individual level, like meaning counting the number of members from the population?
So indeed, I gave you the example of of the simplest model that I could come up with, and that's indeed in terms of numbers of individuals. But I did the same type of thing with, and I show you here. Yes, so I did the entire research I actually replicated with a model that distinguishes three classes: juveniles, immatures, and adults. That models actually the biomass in these three classes, and that this model is a kind of consistent approximation to a more complex model where you have a full size distribution of individuals throughout their lives. And if you do the same, then the same procedure, you find again that introducing this asymmetry leads to larger communities, even larger than I presented in my talk. It also occurs under multiple conditions now. You not only find it with juveniles being more vulnerable, but also when adults are more vulnerable. And you find the similar type of results actually for this more complex model. So you're right. I took a simple model to illustrate this point, but it's more general than that.
If I can add something, because I think Mauricio's question was more like, is your simulations at the level of population dynamics, or did you use some kind of agent-based modeling with it?
No, so it's at the population level. It's the number of individuals.
Yeah, right.
In a particular class.
Right,
Yes.
right.
But sorry, I misunderstood your question.
Yeah, but people have not looked at like agent-based modeling, like individual nodes and stuff. Try to recover the population dynamics. Yeah.
Yes, people have done that, but those are most of those studies are limited to a single population, or maybe two. But so there's a lot of work there on populations with on systems with just a handful of species at most, but not on larger communities.
The reason that I ask is because maybe if you come up with a finer scale model with this age structure, maybe in the right limit, you could see that certain behaviors of this difference in the structure could be represented by some terms in your differential equations of some kind. So it could be interesting to try to see how this matches together.
Yeah, so actually most part of my work has been in what we call more general physiologically structured models, where we take full size distributions of population into account. And the model I presented and used here is actually a phenomenological analog that mimics the dynamics that we have observed in these more complex models. So maybe I already used that that approach that you suggest.
Great, thanks.
Are there any more questions? I cannot hear. Are you asking something, Surush? Or?
Yes, can you hear me now?
You have to speak a bit louder, I think. Yeah.
Sorry. Is it better now?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted to ask this. So what you did is that for each of your species, instead of taking them as a...
Am I freezing, or is...
No, it's Surush.
Sorry, the voice goes down?
Yeah, now we can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry. I was going to say that, do you expect the same type of result to be even stronger if you actually look at 3 or 4 or 5 different stages in the life of one species? So for example, now you have juvenile and adult. If you increase these to, I don't know, infant, juvenile, adult, or infant, juvenile, adult, and old, if you increase these brackets, do you think you get the same result even more pronounced?
Well, I tried to show that with the more complex model, just in answer to the previous question, that if I take 3 stages, juveniles, immatures, and adults, and I introduce some other rules for the transition, then you get also the same results, and under wider conditions even. So maybe you are right that it is. It might be correct that if I introduce more stages, it's indeed I will find the same results or even stronger. The fact that the problem there is then, of course, how do you represent the asymmetry? I was really focusing on the symmetry versus asymmetry, and that's why the 2 stages is easier to analyze and to talk about.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any more questions?
Maybe one remark that I like to make.
Okay, go ahead.
That's indeed that I was also very interested in Andre's work, and we were thinking about this also within our groups, because the stability of diverse systems is more a general problem. So if you think about the cognitive system, but I think, of course, then we have this question actually, why do people not all super specialize on only one thing? And why do we have a diverse cognitive system? How is that actually possible? But also, of course, in the discussion about organizations or economic systems, the stability of a very diverse setup is really a big question. And for us, it's very inspiring to see what actually biologists find, which mechanisms they find to stabilize such diverse systems. So that's one more, that's a possible transfer of this work to these domains that I just like to mention.
It's actually it's nice that you point that out, because it's one of the questions that I have myself. So if you think about if you think about the question, I looked at the network complexity versus a more hierarchical complexity component, and how they interact and lend stability to the system. Yeah. Think about an economic system of industries.
Yeah.
How important is it that you have startups developing into small businesses and then conglomerates or something like that?
Yeah.
So if it were all just competition between similarly sized companies, would you have a system that is less robust, more robust?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
no, it's a very important general question. So I like it a lot. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. There are more questions? No? Okay, then let's thank Andre again.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and to the deep people, just come back here. I'm here, and no one stopping you enter the building. So
you're also at IAS?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, no, but we were told we couldn't come.
No, but I just
okay, all right. All right, I'm gonna stop this.